Here it's going. Thank you.
All right, so moving on to our next speaker. Caitlin Moon is an independent researcher specializing in medieval literature and disability studies. She recently completed her PhD at Trinity College Dublin with a dissertation entitled Legends of the Loathly Lady, Finding Truth Through Transformation. Her research focuses on embodiment, narrative, voice, transformation, and monstrosity in Middle English and Celtic literature, with particular interest in disability theory and affect in the works of John Gower and Geoffrey Chaucer. Her work will also appear in the forthcoming volume, Women in the Ancient Medieval Celtic World. In addition to her academic work, she is writing her first novel, exploring themes of memory, femininity, and the grotesque. And she travels with her companion Leonard.
Thank you. So, where Chaucer masters narrative, Gower fractures it. Most of us here are familiar with the long-standing dichotomy of Geoffrey Chaucer versus John Gower, a relationship that has often been framed through the narrative, the chicken or the egg of influence and priority. Yet this binary, while productive, obscures a more significant distinction, one that has not received the sustained attention that it warrants. Chaucer and Gower were contemporaries, and quite possibly even friends. However, their respective relationships to disability, both biographical and narratological, could not be more different. While Chaucer incorporates disabled figures and voices within the Canterbury Tales, Gower is, at least theoretically, a disabled author. His Confessio Amantis, a sprawling Middle English poem of over 33,000 lines, takes its frame as a confession of courtly love to Genius, the chaplain of Venus. While this structure within the structure unfolds an immense collection of exempla, morally instructive, generically diverse, and often, as many readers have noted, structurally unwieldy. Though the poem is organized according to the 7 deadly sins, its narratives proliferate, digress, and accumulate to the point of excess. The Confessio is, in many ways, intensely moralizing, discursively unstable, and less focused on the confession of a courtly lover than the wandering discourse of an aging and cognitively burdened mind. I want to suggest today that this is not a failure of control, but rather a deliberate formal strategy. Gower tells us as much in the prologue, and I shall now delight you all with my best Sean Connery impersonation. But for mensign and so it is, that what that all of wisdom grit, it doeth oft a manus wit, to him that shall it all day read. This passage does more than acknowledge the tedium of moral discourse. It foregrounds cognitive fatigue, dulled perception, and the limits of sustained attention. Gower positions himself as self-consciously limited, aware not only of his reader's exhaustion, but of his own. This is not merely rhetorical humility. It is a model of impaired cognition. From the outset, then, Amantis, Gower's narrative avatar, emerges not as a lovesick, courtly figure, but rather as a subject marked by cognitive and affective limitation. The poem itself begins accordingly. It wanders, digresses, overloads, and resists linear coherence. In this sense, the Confessio Amantis not only describes impairment, it enacts it. The text behaves as a disabled body. What has often been dismissed as structural failure is, I argue, a disabled narratological mode, a form that produces meaning through limitation rather than mastery. Scholars such as R.F. Yeager, Jonathan Shu, and Leonard J. Davis, not related to my snail, have gestured towards this possibility, whether within Gower studies specifically or in the broader field of disability studies. This paper, therefore, asks us to read Gower's limitations not as failures of form, but as the very conditions through which his narrative voice acquires authority. While Troy Van Deventer-Pierman reads blindness as a part of a system that ultimately moves through narrative and bodily restoration, this paper argues that the Confessio Amantis resists such resolution at the level of form. Rather than fully remembering the divided body, the poem sustains and reproduces instability through its narrative voice. So, as R.F. Yeager observes in his chapter Gower in Winter, the question of Gower's lived experience with blindness remains unresolved. Whether Gower adopts this voice of an aging, impaired narrator as a rhetorical strategy, one that permits him to directly moralize and critique a king under politically precarious circumstances, or whether he aligns himself with the authoritative figure of the blind poet Homer, or whether he was, in fact, experiencing the impairments associated with old age, is, for the purposes of this paper, ultimately beside the point. What matters is not whether Gower was blind, but how blindness functions within the Confessio Amantis. Strikingly, the poem offers no sustained or coherent poetics of blindness. Instead, references to blindness appear intermittently, dispersed across moral, affective, and epistemological registers. In Book 1, for instance, Gower evokes the familiar trope of love's blindness, for love is blind, it may not say. At first glance, it appears that a conventional gesture within a discourse of courtly love, one that remains legible even to modern audiences. Love obscures judgment, produces miscognition, distorts perception, and, in the case of Amantis, results in a profound epistemological instability. Yet to dismiss this as mere cliche is to miss structural significance. Gower's use of blindness does not stabilize into a simple metaphor, nor does it remain confined to the domain of affect. Instead, blindness emerges as a mode of knowing, specifically, a mode of knowing incorrectly. In this sense, blindness in the Confessio is neither purely biographical nor merely figurative. It is epistemological. It governs how perception fails, how judgment falters, and how knowledge itself becomes unreliable. Gower repeatedly frames moral failure as perceptual failure. In Book 3, blindness emerges not as a singular metaphor, but as a proliferating condition that destabilizes perception itself. For example, as the blind lead another leadeth. Here, blindness operates relationally. The image of the blind leading the blind collapses the individual and collective judgment alike, suggesting not merely error, but the reproduction of error across bodies and systems. Gower extends this instability through additional figures, such as the bird who saith the net and not the net, and the subject whose wit hath lured his remembrance. In each case, perception fails not at the level of sight alone, but across cognition and memory. What is striking is not any single image, but rather their accumulation. Rather than clarifying moral truth, Gower multiplies analogies, producing a kind of interpretive excess in which meaning remains unstable. Blindness diffuses across perception, cognition, and volition, resisting containment within any singular framework. Later in Book 3, Gower relocates this instability within the mind. For love of a wonder kinda, and hath his witness often blind. Here, blindness is no longer a matter of misseeing, but of cognitive disorder. The witness themselves are rendered blind, causing them fromanis raison fall. Judgment is no longer anchored in reason, but displaced by affect. Here, blindness becomes an internal condition, an epistemological instability that reorders the hierarchy of thought. Taken together, these passages suggest that blindness in the Confessio is not a discrete failure, but a distributed condition. It is not merely that the subject sees incorrectly, it is that the faculties governing perception, cognition, and judgment have themselves become unreliable. In Book 3, blindness is located within perception and cognition. Book 6 extends this into judgment. In Book 6, blindness is no longer confined to perception or cognition, but is reconfigured as a failure of judgment in action. Cupid, described as the blind butler, distributes sweetness and bitterness indiscriminately. Taketh the bad for the good, and gives the trouble instead of clear. Blindness here manifests not as an inability to see, but as an inability to judge and allocate correctly. As a result, outcomes become arbitrary. Some drink undeserved of the best, while others suffer without cause. The consequence is a collapse of order itself as the human experience unfolds upon Chaucer without the law of governance. Gower reinforces this instability by emphasizing that even favorable outcomes remain contingent. Because the butler which birthed the key is blind, a desirable result may occur only per cause. If the butler happens to draw from the swetatana, such moments pleasure is not earned through good judgment, but granted accidentally. In this context, blindness produces not only error, but destabilizes justice itself, as both suffering and reward are distributed without the law of governance. It does not merely result in misjudgment, it abolishes the very possibility of just judgment. This logic is not confined to Cupid. Earlier in Book 2, Gower describes fortune as a blind wheel, in which turn oft ere men beware. Here, blindness is no longer located in individual perception or judgment, but in the very mechanisms that govern human experience. The consequences are similarly catastrophic, as the turning wheel destroys without warning, drowning a great party in those cases. Blindness thus emerges not only as a human limitation, but as a condition embedded within the structures that govern human experience. Within such a framework, Gower's own blindness cannot be read as a mere disclaimer or rhetorical evasion. Rather, it signals a reconfiguration of authority, say that 3 times fast, one that acknowledges the instability of judgment and the limits of human knowledge. If outcomes are governed upon chance, then the poet does not stand outside the condition, but rather participates in it. Gower's authority thus emerges not from certainty, but from his capacity to represent and inhabit the failures of perception and judgment that he describes. Once blindness operates at this level, its implications for narrative voice become unavoidable. It becomes increasingly clear that blindness in the Confessio of Amantis is not confined to individual perception, but operates across multiple systems of relation. In Book 5, Genius describes the personified sin of avarice as blind, yet this blindness is neither singular nor self-contained. Blind avarice of his lineage for consul and cousinage hath on scarceness that he no good let out of on. Here, blindness is genealogical. It is inherited, reinforced through counsel and cousinage, and maintained through figures such as scarceness, who function as its agents of preservation. Blindness, in this instant, is not a failure of sight, but a condition sustained through social and material networks. This suggests that blindness in Gower is not merely descriptive, but structural. It does not reside in a single subject, but circulates across relationships, institutions, and modes of exchange. The poem itself participates in this circulation. Its digressions, excesses, and accumulation do not simply represent blindness, they reproduce it. In this sense, the Confessio Amantis did not really merely depict an impaired person, it performs impairment. Its narrative voice, fragmented, recursive, and resistant to its own regulation, may thus be understood as a disabled narratological form. Blindness here begins to resemble what disability theorists describe as a distribution or relational condition, one that exceeds the boundaries of the individual body. Drawing on the work of Leonard Davis and Alison Kafer, the poem's instability emerges not as a localized defect, but as a systematic condition. If blindness operates as a distributed condition within the Confessio, it follows that the poem's narrative voice cannot be understood as stable, coherent, or fully authoritative. Rather, it emerges as a site of strain, shaped by the very instabilities it attempts to diagnose. The movement between Amun's genius and the proliferating exempla does not produce clarity, but accumulation, an excess of discourse that overwhelms both speaker, listener, and reader. Amun's himself repeatedly registers this condition. He describes his witness as overcome and confesses an inability to govern his own thought or speech. These moments are typically contained within the conventions of courtly lovesickness, yet they also signal a broader failure of cognitive and narrative control. The problem is not that Amun cannot see clearly, it is that he cannot process or order or contain what he experiences. What emerges then is not merely a representation of impaired perception, but a narration shaped by impairment. The Confessio does not progress towards linear resolution. It wanders, stalls, digresses, and accumulates. This structure resists coherence in the way that mirror cognitive and perceptual instabilities it attributes to its speakers. In this respect, the poem's narrative voice is not a failed attempt at authority, but a deliberately disabled form, one that produces meaning through limitation rather than mastery. Gower, however, repeatedly foregrounds his own erudition. The Confessio Amantis moves across 3 languages, draws upon an expansive array of exempla from both biblical and classical traditions, and it is, in many respects, a display of moral and intellectual authority. Why, then, does Gower construct a narrative voice marked by instability, excess, and limitation? While authorial intention remains ultimately inaccessible, the effect is nonetheless clear. The poem's structure, notably organized around the confession of courtly love, it more closely resembles an extended, recursive exchange that accumulates rather than resolves. What should produce clarity instead generates discursivity. What should diagnose becomes diffused. Within this framework, the figure of Amantis takes on new significance. His confession does not merely narrate the experience of a lover, but exposes the subject already defined by cognitive and affective limitation. These moments, his overwhelmed wits, his inability to regulate or order his own speech, align not with the conventions of lovesickness, but with the poem's broader narrative instability. It is here in the narrative voice itself that the distinction between Amantis and Gower begins to erode. Although Book 8 stages a formal identification between the two, the poem has already, through its disabled narrative voice, disestablished the separation between the speaker and the authorial persona. The instability that marks Amantis is not confined to character. It is embedded within the narrative voice itself. Thus, the reveal at the end of Book 8 does not introduce a new identity, so much as confirm a condition that has structured the poem from the outset. Gower does not emerge through Amantis at the poem's conclusion. He is already present in the very instability through which Amantis speaks. Scholarship such as that of Tori Van Deventer Pierman has demonstrated the centrality of blindness in the Confessio Amantis, particularly in this revelation to the confession's capacity to remember, and the divided body through the narrative, yet the poem's formal structure complicates this restorative model. While confession promises coherence, the Confessio itself resists it. Rather than resolving division, the poem reproduces it through its narrative voice. Its digressions, excesses, and recursive movements do not culminate in clarity, but in accumulation. Blindness, in this sense, is not cured. It is sustained at the level of form. Within this framework, the identification of Amantis with Gower in Book 8 appears less as a moment of resolution than as a formal recognition of a condition already in operation. The instability that marks Amantis has, from the outset, been embedded within the narrative voice itself, shaping not only what the poem says, but how it speaks. What Chaucer could not see is that narrative authority does not emerge despite limitation, but through it. Thank you.